want to see something really scary.
Attention. Do I have everybody's attention now?
And now it's overtime, and I'm your host, Mike Gilbert, and I'm joined as always by JD Oliva. How you doing, JD?
I reamed people in the chat this week on the regular show, and I feel kind of bad about it. The problem is when they poke the bear, like it gets so much more engagement and feedback, and I'm always like, God, why do I have to be so mean to get people to talk to us? Jeez.
Yeah, I thought it was entertaining.
And I'm glad.
There's some parallels between the dying days of WCW and some of the mistakes they made, and with what AEW is doing now. Now AEW is a million times better. So I know, like our old boss Garrett was like, don't let anybody ever compare modern AEW or WWE to the dying days of WCW. I'm not talking about the quality of the TV show. I'm just talking about the downward trends in business. Talking about the over-reliance on some older talent. They're trying to fix that right now. They're trying to build some newer stars, but there are some similar mistakes that they're making.
Here's the thing: is you could say the same thing about the new generation era WWF too. Like, because like for all this talk of new generation, Bob Backlund was the champion. King Kong Bundy was there. Like they had a lot of older guys that were in very prominent roles, and business was trending low. They were doing TV tape. They were doing Raw tapings in high school gyms.
Yep.
But WWE we don't talk about that. We always say, WCW, because they're the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Right. WWF was allowed to course correct, but AEW, time will tell if they're mid 90s WWF or early 2000s WCW.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they're mid 90s WWF, because obviously the business came back in a big way. So WCW, Who Killed WCW episode 4. I think by the end of the series, I was like, this thing is an abomination.
Yeah, this is god awful.
So, and you know what? And I always really dig the guys that make this show. I think by them joining forces with Ed Free Shows, and by them joining forces with Brian Gewirtz and $7 Entertainment, all of them who are just so super friendly with Eric Bischoff. This went from trying to be like a truthful retelling of who killed WCW, and maybe even answering that question, which they didn't do. They didn't answer the question. And they really just tried to repair the image of one Eric Bischoff. So by the end, by the end of it, it was like, yes, Vince Russo is still dumb. They gave Vince Russo an opportunity to explain himself, but he made himself sound stupider. And they gave 3 episodes to Eric Bischoff where he was basically putting culpability on everybody else other than himself.
I said it in week 1 when we did this. This is going to be the Eric Bischoff Reclamation Project. And that's what it was. And now there's a bunch of people. Fortunately, the ratings aren't that good for this thing. So there's not that many people that will watch this and will, be converted. But there are like the ad-free show idiots that choose to listen to Eric Bischoff every single week. There's professional wrestlers that work for him that didn't even like listening to him for a single week, let alone people that dedicate 2 hours of their week every single week to listening to the ramblings of an incompetent idiot. And, for those people, you're lost to begin with. But what a waste of time and effort and energy.
Yeah, so episode 4, what I did like about it, and I'll talk about what I did like. I did like seeing that unreleased footage from the cameraman going on. I thought that was pretty cool, because I was like, oh, wow, this is a little bit of my childhood. And I said in episode 1, what I like about documentaries, what's important to me is that A, that I learned something, or B, I get to relive certain moments in my life that I remember, and then B, C, I'm entertained, right? And so I thought episode 1 didn't educate me very much, but I felt like it was entertained. By episode 2, I was like, this is a shit show, right? Like Bischoff is just really trying to repair his image. Episode 3, Vince Russo's trying to repair his image and he fails to do so. And I felt like I know they let him get away with a lot, but they still had some other people calling him out on it. Episode 4 was just all about how it was the AOL Time Warner is what killed WCW, and it had nothing to do with, except for one small comment that Guy Evans made. Guy Evans is the guy that wrote the Nitro book, and he co-wrote a book with not only Dave Pinzer but Eric Bischoff, so you kind of know where his head's at. Where Guy Evans said, well, in the year 2000 or 1999 WCW Uncensored, they had they sold like over 300,000 pay-per-views, and then the very next year with the same main event, Hogan and Flair on top, they sold like 60,000 pay-per-views with 81% decrease. And he said that, but they glossed over it, and then they go right back to the fact that Jamie Kellner hated wrestling and didn't want anything to do with it, that Brad Siegler and Stu Snyder were, in collusion to kill the company, that way WWF could buy it, which actually might actually
I actually do believe that.
Which actually could be a grain of truth. But what they didn't say was that people stopped watching, people stopped going, and people stopped paying for the shows, which is ultimately what killed WCW.
Mm-hmm. Apathy and stupidity killed WCW.
Yeah.
And Eric Bischoff was the leader of it for the whole time that was happening. That's the truth. Like, Jamie Kellner just passed away this past week. So the fact that he died this week is a little ironic, little apropos, we should say. It's a shame when anyone loses their life. I think he's been a bad guy to pro wrestling fans for a long time. And in reality, shows weren't good. They weren't selling tickets. It was no longer a good television program. Still did all right in the ratings, which people kind of forget. Like, we get so lost in the hype of the Monday Night Wars. Nitro was still really competitive, even when it was really bad. The problem was, like, people stopped caring. And it wasn't bad WCW that died. It was irrelevant WCW that died.
Yeah. Well, and so it was doing like okay in the ratings, like it wasn't like tanked completely. That was a far cry from what it was, and it was at its peak, but it was still competitive. But here was the problem: it was so sleazy that they couldn't sell advertising, right? And it was so irrelevant and it was so uncool that they couldn't get advertisers to buy time on it. Honestly, this would have been, so say that Jamie Kellner keeps it, right? And like Fusion Media is able to go through with the sell. So if you guys I'm talking to you guys like you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to like rehash the whole episode. So if you haven't watched the episode, or if you haven't checked out our series on the WCW invasion of the WWF in 2001, we went week by week with this whole thing. So I'm not going to rehash everything completely, but let's just say, for instance, that Fusion Media successfully purchases WCW and they get to keep their time slot on, I think it was going to be on TBS. They were not going to get to keep Nitro, but they were going to get to keep TBS, right? Say that happened. Why would Jamie Kellner and why would AOL Time Warner believe that on Eric Bischoff's third attempt to turn this thing around that he would be successful? What in his history, other than the small period that he was successful from 96 to 98, what would make them believe that he would be able to do that again when he already tried it the year before and was unsuccessful? He could not lead this company back to the promised land. Why would they think that? Honestly, if Jamie Kellner did keep it, it very likely would have continued to go down the wrong way. And I know that some people believe that maybe he would have changed and turned the thing around, but maybe he would have, but from their point of view, why would they? Honestly, if they did keep it, they might have looked like fools if they did keep the WCW program on TBS.
It would have still done decent ratings. It could have gone worse. We have a friend that would actually have been on the front lines of the WCW reboot.
Yeah.
Who, Mike, our buddy John truly thinks that it would have been a lot better. He would have been booking the cruiserweights. Yeah. He shared with us his ideas. I wrote an article about it back in 2021. And I think that would have been better, but I don't think you're wrong. I think the ultimate problem is Eric Bischoff is not a very creative guy. A creative guy has multiple ideas. Eric Bischoff had one idea, and I'm not even sure it was his idea. The NWO thing has a lot of people that lay claim to it. In reality, we talked about this last week. The NWO idea was like lifting. There's nothing wrong with lifting ideas. Like everyone does it. There's no problem lifting ideas. The concept of the NWO, the foreign invasion, is something that's uniquely Japanese, right? It had been really the first time we'd really seen that in America, right? Where this foreign invader was taking over. Like we had little minor invasions like ECW and the WWE and like, you know, the Memphis stuff. And, you know, it's not uncommon to have promotional wars. But the NWO is so uniquely Japanese. It's very much like the UWF angles of New Japan, right? And we've seen tons of those over there. So Bischoff clearly lived, whether he remembers it or not, he clearly lifts from there. And that was kind of it. Like, based on the fact that if you watch him multiple times and on, it was always the same concept. Invading force coming in, taking over. Look when he had TNA, when he was running TNA. What was the angle?
I think he did it a couple of times in TNA.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just kept rehashing the same angle.
Like, the big one that we always think about is Aces and Eights. That was just NWO meets Sons of Anarchy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
They actually, it was so Sons of Anarchy. The actual theme song, like, was a complete and utter ripoff of Sons of Anarchy.
Oh, it's Dale Oliver, man. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
You know, that's just kind of what he did.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, that's the problem is Eric. I mean, like, say what you want about Vince Russo comes off like a complete idiot every time he has a chance to talk. The fact that the man has acolytes is just astounding to me. There's not many of them though, but they're very loud. They're very loud.
Yeah.
He's far more creative than Eric Bischoff is. The problem is he's not very good at it. Like, he has a lot of great ideas, but he has more ideas than Eric Bischoff has.
What Eric Bischoff is really good at is selling other people's ideas because he's a salesman. Yeah. He's a charming guy, and he's good on television. You know, and I bet if you get him into the room, he could probably sell you something. Like especially if you were remotely interested in it, but that's how he got his start in pro wrestling. He was trying to sell his Ninja Star Wars game on AWA television. And Vern Gagne was impressed by the guy because he had a little bit of a shooter background with his kickboxing stuff. And
wrestling. He was an amateur wrestler too.
Yeah, he was. And then he brought him onto a show as an announcer. And that's how he got to start. And then he would go around like selling advertising for AWA. The guy's a salesman. He sold himself to these producers and they're buying into it. They're complete frauds now. This Evan Husney and Guy Evans, not Guy Evans, Evan Husney and the other guy, Jason Eisner. They essentially put out a fraudulent documentary, and they flat out refused to have anybody that had any journalistic background on the show. Like they didn't bring in Keller, they didn't bring in Dave Meltzer, Brian Alvarez. Anybody that wrote on the subject during that time was avoided because they felt that maybe they would be too biased. When in reality, they were the ones covering it, and they were in the shit, trying to decipher fact from fiction in this world of grifting liars and lunatics, you know.
Mike, we have to call this what it was. This is a piece of propaganda.
Yeah 100%. And you know what, I hate to say this, you called it on episode 1. You compared it to like a Nazi film.
I compared Husney to Lenny Riefenstahl, and God, I really don't hate being right, but you could just smell this coming a mile away, you know. And it just, Eric Bischoff's a slick character, but I mean, like, that's all he really is. He's just a snake oil salesman. He's not even really that successful. He should be so wealthy that money should be coming out of his ears, but it isn't.
No,
it isn't. You know, he's kind of squandered a lot of stuff. Like, he wanted to be Vince so bad. And say what you want about Vince, but Vince actually is pretty creative. You know, Vince had vision. Vince knew what he was doing. Vince is a horrible human being, but I mean, like, Vince knew how to do this job. Eric just wasn't that guy.
No.
Well, I mean, like, we're too young for this, but I'm sure our contemporaries that are older than us wanted Bill Watts to be that guy, and he just wasn't.
Nope.
You know, truth of the matter is that nobody could have saved WCW.
Yeah, once it started sinking, it was over because like the wounds were just too big, and they just kept getting bigger and bigger over every year. You know what I mean? And it started at WCW Starrcade 97, and then WCW Thunder happens, and then the squandering of Bill Goldberg, and then the taking on of, like, I think, you know, we've talked about it before, and I know a lot of other people talked about it. Those contracts that they were giving out to those people, guaranteed contracts, like that were so huge to people. I'm not talking about their tippy top guys. I'm talking like guys in their 40s that were never really draws, making high 6-figure contracts that were guaranteed. Now, when WCW was at its peak and they were profiting, it made sense to give those guys those contracts. But once this started to go down and people were no longer coming to the buildings, you started to pay those guys those deals. And then so that was also absolutely a problem. They signed way too many people, and a lot of people that were just there for the paycheck that did not want to see the company grow, that didn't care about it. Kevin Nash, right? Like once Kevin Nash was like, oh, this company's sinking, fuck it, I'm out. And then he's just kind of like chilling. And that was one of the things on this episode that really like brought to light. But he was like, why the fuck would I go there? It's dying. I'm just going to sit at home and collect my check. I don't care about this place.
Yeah, he's there's a lot. He bears a lot of responsibility too.
Yeah.
I have a controversial take on this. I think you can actually start pinpointing WCW dying to 1986. Right? I think you can trace this back to the Great American Bash Tour when they started paying David Allen when Crockett. It's funny. You gave me that interview, which, we stole from ad-free shows. I have no problem admitting that.
I gave you part 2 today, by the way.
Oh, I want that.
It's in your email.
Oh, you're the man. Thank you. Crockett, Jim Crockett is like, I'm so glad I got to hear this, because man's passed now. He's very brutally honest. I love that. I love when guys can look back and admit their faults and say, you know what? I didn't do a very good job on this. I did a good job on this. This is true. No, this is hype. And I like when when a guy's being honest. Like you and I are both big Jeff Jarrett fans.
Yeah.
Because like there's a tone in a man's voice when you can hear them being real and you know that they are not trying to save themselves all the time and they can admit culpability. That's the problem with Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff isn't that guy, right? Jim Crockett was like, he was very clearly telling his story and like he knew when things were right and things weren't. And he was talking about how he didn't fight back enough against Dusty when he wanted to do all this crazy stuff in 86. And they just thought the money would keep coming in. And then they started losing money in 86 and then they got uncool in 87.
Yeah.
Right. They never recovered from you know what? I take that back. You can actually trace it back to Magnum TA's car accident. They had so much invested in Magnum TA being the guy. And there's a good chance he would have been the guy and been super successful because the whole promotion was booked around him and Dusty. And Dusty is very clearly setting the table so that Magnum can be their version of Hulk Hogan. And it doesn't happen because, Magnum gets into a horrible car accident that doesn't end his life, but ends his career. And they just weren't ready to rebound. Like, how do you rebound off that? Imagine if that happens to WWF in 1986. Where do you go?
Yeah. If Hulk, at that point, they're in a lot of trouble because like they had some stars on the right, like Roddy Piper obviously was over. Randy Savage was getting there. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't the big star that he became a couple years later. They had Steamboat and they had Andre, but Andre is on the downside of his career at that point. Paul Orndorff, was a very big draw when he was with Hogan, and then he did some stuff, outside of WWF. But other than that, like he wasn't really like he needed Hogan to be able to draw those houses, right?
No, but
so Hogan was the straw that stirs the drink for that entire promotion for a decade.
None of those guys could have carried. And again, we're not Hulk Hogan fans. This is not the Hulk Hogan reclamation project. But the reality is
realistic, yeah.
Yes, the reality is if Hulk Hogan gets into a Porsche accident in 1986 and he's paralyzed and can't wrestle, they don't have that guy ready to go to step in. Could it have been Savage? Maybe, but in 86, I don't think he's ready. If you do so what they did with Magnum is they took the hottest heel in the company and turned him babyface, which wasn't Flair, it was Nikita.
Yeah.
Right? That's exactly what you're proposing here with Savage. Would have been the exact same thing. And Savage is way better than Nikita, don't get me wrong. Yeah. But I don't think the results are very different. Think about that. So Crockett isn't ready to have that guy, right? And then they falter, and then Ted Turner picks up the scraps. And the company's on life support for nearly a decade.
Yeah.
Until they start drawing money in early 96.
Yeah, yeah, and so you could say Eric Bischoff legit with what he was doing saved WCW because
Oh yeah,
I'm sure there's people that wanted to get rid of it prior to them being profitable. Like there's a lot of people there.
Have you read Guy Evans' book? No,
I have
never mind.
not. No.
Check the audiobook. That's how I read it. Actually, I listened to the audiobook. It's a great audiobook. Yeah, no, the 100%. When Ted Turner decided, because Vince sent him a letter that pissed him off because Vince can never stop kicking at hornet's nest. That's why Nitro happened.
Yeah,
because Ted just got pissed and said, "Yep, we're going to give you a spot right against them." And people in TNT were like, "What the fuck? We have to have wrestling on our network? What the hell?" That's
and Brad Siegler said as much in I believe episode 1. I think.
Yes, sir. That's the truth. But again, so you could actually say the 2 years of WCW was successful was an aberration because for the majority of the company's existence, it was not.
It lost, and you've said this several times, and they talked like Brad Siegler said it. It's like, why do we still have this company? It loses money every single year, with the exception of 2 years. It was a money loser outside of that 2 years. Like it makes no sense to keep it.
Ted liked wrestling.
Yeah.
And Ted, something that Jim Crockett said in the interviews, Ted always wanted to own wrestling. That's why he backed Ann Gunkel when she had the big Georgia War in the mid 70s, is that Ted wanted to have the wrestling and he wanted to be part of it and he wanted to own it. Ted liked wrestling. He didn't watch every week, but he liked it. He knew that people loved wrestling and he thought it was cool.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and he knew that helped build his network, you know?
This is the thing. If Ted isn't forced out, the show probably survives. Right?
So yeah, maybe it survives, but I think the greater point that needs to be made, and I think where they should have went with the end of Who Killed WCW, is that so if Ted isn't forced out, yeah, they're going to continue to bleed money for a while. Ted wasn't going to give up on the thing, but so he is forced out. If WCW was still making money, they would still be on the air.
Oh, I agree with that.
They were canceled because the business was going to shit. They were losing money, and they were going to sell the thing, but they canceled the TV show because they couldn't sell ads because it was so uncool and so ineffective that it wasn't no longer a hot property. So they had no reason to keep it, and that's why WCW died. They didn't die because of infighting and politics among Turner executives and all this stuff. They didn't die because Jamie Kellner's this boogeyman that hated wrestling. If it was making them money, they would have kept it, right? It's not a fucking charity. This is a business, you idiots. So Jamie Kellner's not a bad guy because he canceled your shit property. He canceled it because he was just being a smart businessman. Hey, we need to actually talk about Bix's article on Babyface
we should.
Yeah, so that was a very good article. He's saying that there was forces within Turner that basically put a poison pill in that Fusion Media deal, saying that if Fusion Media, so go check out Bix's article on Babyface versus Heel. So Fusion Media putting together the deal, they made the proposal to TBS or to Turner, and one of the Turner people who had it out for Jamie Kellner had it put into the contract that if WCW got canceled, then Fusion Media would still own the rights to that time slot, and they could put anything else that they wanted on there. Now that is not a proven thing. I think that's more of a theory at this point, but it did seem like it was legit. And so there was that factor in too. And so they were trying to make Jamie Kellner look bad, and had Jamie Kellner sign that deal and put them on, and then gave Fusion Media autonomy over that time slot, he would have been ousted as an executive.
No, 100%. That is definitely a poison pill. I remember Bix and Chris discovered that on their BT at the Between the Sheets podcast, Patreon podcasts, much like this one. They did the death of WCW, and they did an amazing job, amazingly thorough job. I highly recommend their Death of WCW podcasts. They uncover some really interesting things. They talk a lot about Lenita Erickson and what she was trying to bring to the table. Like there's a lot that gets glossed over sometimes. So yeah, Stu Snyder and Brad Siegel were fraternity brothers at Cornell. They were friends. They did have a relationship. Siegel wanted to sell it to his buddy because he knew they could do something with it. Right? Turner didn't want him. Like I said, it was losing money. They didn't like it to begin with. It was a black eye, and then it wasn't Turner anymore. It was AOL.
Yeah.
right? And AOL was not a successful merger. That company is known for being one of the worst mergers in the history of corporate assassinry. Like WCW is a victim of that, but they allowed themselves to be a victim of it.
Yeah.
It was a bad show.
Yeah. If they were, if they weren't on such a losing streak, and very likely would not. And if they did get canceled on a winning streak, then maybe you would have an argument. Then maybe Bischoff would have an argument. It's like, look, this thing was coming back up. We were becoming profitable again. Ratings are back up. Houses are back up, and they still canceled us. So, okay, well then yeah, they're assholes. But no, it wasn't the case. Like everything was shit by the end of it. That if they didn't cancel, that they would have been fools.
I actually think you could argue that it was actually worse in 2000 than it is in 2001. Like there's actually when they canceled the show, it wasn't awful. Like it wasn't good, but I mean, like it was better than it was around Bash at the Beach, 9 months before then. However, like we talked about AEW, once the train starts going in one direction, it takes a long time for things to kind of catch up.
Yeah.
Right? Like WWF started getting good in 97. By the time it gets really popular in 98, the show isn't as good as it was the year before, but the train's already moving that way. Right? Yeah. AEW starts to slip, and someone's like, well, it's gone down since the Brochachos. And it's like, bro, it's been going down before the Brochachos. The Brochachos got that avalanche ball rolling, like that big old boulder that chases Indiana Jones. It just gains momentum the further downhill it goes.
Well, right? And I think the Brochachos, and we'll go here in a couple of minutes, but I think the Brochachos being so bad kind of almost made it okay. Like we started to then talk about how bad the show was at that point, but prior to then they had the benefit of the doubt. And maybe we were all in a little bit of denial because we just loved the show so much. 100%. But once the Brochachos happened, they were like, okay, no, these guys are idiots. Yeah. And they're making some pretty glaring mistakes. And then we started to notice the ones that we didn't notice before. Now all the other blemishes are out there in the open, and now we're all actively talking about it. And now, and I think that that's still the case. We're being honest when we're, insulting them essentially.
The Punk Nightmare stuff was bad, but the TV was still pretty good at the time.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think it started really hitting the TV product until last year. Right. And then they had completely lost their identity at that point because like they had so much invested in Punk, and that was just turned out that was a bad marriage. Man, you guys were in love at first and it looked like it was going to go good. And you find out she's crazy and, killed your dog,
Yeah. But let's put a bow on this whole WCW thing. I think the answer to who killed WCW is a lot of people and a lot of things. I think the person most at fault is Eric Bischoff. And I'll always believe that because he was in charge. He made a lot of bad decisions. He's like, and he put a lot of people in positions that they shouldn't have been in. Like it happened on his watch. He gets fired in 99. They bring in Vince Russo, but by that point it was already too late. This thing was going downhill, and nobody was bringing it back to life. That is my opinion. But if you say, well, no, it was a combination of Bischoff, Kevin Nash, Hulk Hogan. I think Hulk Hogan should be a big part of that. Bad contracts, and then AOL Time Warner not wanting the show anymore. Yeah, all those things are true, but I think that if it did not get off the rails as bad as it did under Eric Bischoff's watch, it would still be a company.
Here's the thing. Jim Herd took it over and ran it into the ground immediately. Eric Bischoff. So there's this, quickly, I don't want to get up on this. There's this story about this. I don't know if you've read it. There's this plastic surgeon that accidentally killed his wife while he was doing surgery. Have you read about this?
No.
So there's this plastic surgeon, right? He did all these like procedures on his wife, and he was performing surgery on her in his clinic, right? And she was getting some crazy stuff done. She just took like a handful of barbiturates, then he started operating on her, and then she starts waking up during the surgery. So he sticks her full of a bunch of undiluted lidocaine, and then her body, she goes into seizure.
Wow.
Right? And then he goes, no, don't call the ambulance. I can save her. She winds up going to the hospital anyway. So he does save her in that moment. She lives for another 2 weeks in the hospital, basically in a coma, never regains consciousness, but she's alive, and then has a heart attack and dies. I kind of think like that's kind of what happened here. Like it was bad, and then he saved it,
Yeah.
but his actions in saving it caused the downfall. Because all the stuff that saves WCW is the stuff that puts it in the ground. Maybe that was a really harsh metaphor, but I don't know. I see a parallel.
I think it was accurate, but the things that saved WCW winded up killing it.
Yeah,
ultimately.
That's what I was going for. I was really harsh in the long run, but I think that
yeah. I hope that is the last time we talk about who killed WCW, but I get the feeling this topic is going to rear its ugly head again.
I'm sick of it. I feel like every year we talk about this at least for a few weeks.
Well, we did a whole series on the WCW invasion where we went week by week and kind of relived some of this stuff, and it was actually kind of fun. But
it was. I had a good time with it. We had Muse on. Muse got to tell his story. That was fun.
Yeah. So that whole thing was really cool. But all right, guys, that is going to do it for us on this episode of Overtime. Next week, I don't know what we're going to talk about on the next episode of Overtime, but we'll come up with something. I'm always got. I'm full of ideas. I'm full of a lot of things, but ideas are one of the things that I'm full of. So we'll come up with something.
Maybe we'll do a Forbidden Door wrap-up show. We've never done one of those before.
Yeah, we haven't. It's that it gets to be a little bit tough with how late those things go, but maybe we could try it. Yeah,
maybe we can try it. I have no school Monday.
Okay, well we will talk, but and until next time, mahalo.
This podcast is a member of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network.
I'm sorry, guys. I hit the wrong button. Hold on. Let me hit the right button.
I want to see something really scary.
Attention. Do I have everybody's attention now?